Yo, 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 it's your boy here, Dustin Riccio, D. Rich, on the Army of Crime podcast. I'm here with Maddie Big Time. Maddie, how it do, player?
I have no comment on that opening.
How's it going, man? What are you up to?
Pretty good. I just started playing Final Fantasy 1 for the first time. It's really hard.
That's really exciting.
It is. Yeah.
I'm happy for you.
Yeah.
Did you happen to watch any movies lately?
I watched the movie Hellboy 2: The Golden Army a couple days ago.
I also watched the movie Hellboy 2: The Golden Army, and I also recently reread a collection of Krazy Kat comics called Krazy and Ignatz 1916 to 1918.
I also did that by sheer coincidence. Perhaps we should record an episode on it.
Yes, would you like to discuss these two things?
I believe that we will. Follow me into my office.
So, Hellboy 2: The Golden Army is the sequel to the film Hellboy, which films are written and directed by Guillermo del Toro, and they are, of course, adaptations of the Mike Mignola comic book series, long-running comic book series, Hellboy. Matt, you and I are both big fans of the Hellboy comics, so setting aside how close of an adaptation it is, which we can get into, what did you think of Hellboy 2: The Golden Army?
I thought it was a reasonably well-made movie. I think the actors do a good job with their characters. You've got Ron Perlman as Hellboy. You've got Doug Jones, I believe, as Abe Sapien. And you have Selma Blair as Liz Sherman. I think they all do a good job. Jeffrey Tambor, bumbling bureaucrat character, even got a couple of laughs out of me. So I think it's a reasonably well-made movie. I thought it was fun. Good performances. I think the strength of the movie, and I feel like probably a lot of people would agree with me on this, the strength of the movie is the production design.
Yeah, there's a lot of, like, basically almost like every scene, it seems like they're introducing you to some new, like, wild, like, monster creature design or some kind of crazy set or something that is just, like, really wildly imaginative. It's kind of like, you know, every time the scene changes, there's some kind of new thing that you get to marvel at, which is it's really impressive, and a lot of it, to my recollection, is original to this film. I think they're not just like recreating things from the comics. I believe basically everything in the story and like the villains and stuff are all created for this film.
Yeah, it is reminiscent of some of the high fantasy aspects of the later Hellboy stories. For example, the Warthog guy with the iron hand kind of reminded me of the Goblin with the iron shoes, for example.
I thought about that too.
Yeah, so it is kind of reminiscent of some of the later Hellboy stories where they get into the fairy world and the vampires and everything. But yeah, for the most part, it's pretty original. It is an interesting look. You've got like a high fantasy meets steampunk interacting with the federal agent sci-fi law enforcement of the BPRD. So it's actually a very interesting look for the movie.
Yeah, Guillermo del Toro is super into the steampunk, like clockwork kind of stuff, and he's also really into Universal monster movies. So of course there's a couple of references to Universal monster movies, which honestly I find to be a little much. And then they're not Universal monster movies, but the obvious references to such. He also seems to be into, for some reason, like bad guys doing like twirling kung fu moves, which I could kind of take or leave. But overall, I would agree with you that the best part about this movie is the production design and the costumes and the effects, which are all really imaginative and well done. Like there's a giant like forest god like creature, which is really cool looking. It's like the size of a building that Hellboy has to fight.
Yeah, and I do like the design on the elves. They kind of remind me of Michael Moorcock's Elric character with the albino skin and the long hair. So I like the elves. I have no problem with them. Like I said, I like the Warthog guy with the iron hand. I even like the throne room for the King of the Elves. Looks like it's in an abandoned factory or something. So it's that interesting mixture of high fantasy and steampunk.
Yeah, the problem with the villain though is that he's once you get over the design, he's just really not that interesting of a guy. He's like a very generic, like I must take over the world style of supervillain.
Yeah, which maybe leads us into the weak part of this movie, which is probably the story. They have to collect the magic doodads to stop the evil thing from arising.
Yeah, the story involves several these like MacGuffins that they have to get, and the story about like elves, and yeah, I overall did not really find myself getting very invested in the story. And like Abe Sapien has a romance with this woman that he like meets and falls in love with in like one day, which not that this movie is the only movie that does that, obviously, because that's a very standard like Hollywood trope, but like I didn't buy that at all. And yeah, overall, I feel like the story just was not that engaging. And like you said, it's not really the actors' faults in any way. I just think that the film is so concerned with rolling out its own mythology and giving you reasons to look at cool things that it never really finds any kind of emotional investment, which I would also say is maybe something that's common to some other Guillermo del Toro films, who I know has a pretty big fan base in general, but I find a lot of his films to be, or at least several of his films I have found to be sort of like really nice looking and really creative in like the production design and the effects. And then the story is just kind of like really blah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Compared to the first one, it really doesn't go all that much into the Hellboy mythology or like the background of the character of Hellboy. You could almost transplant most of the storyline of this movie into some other movie.
Yeah, I mean, they get into it a little bit at the end, but it is, I guess, yeah, kind of like a just a generic like fantasy chase MacGuffin kind of thing.
Yeah. And like I said, I didn't mention the troll market. The troll market is amazing. And I can
Yeah,
see why that's in the movie, but it's like the troll market, what we go there, we see the troll market. There's a lot of cool fantasy characters. What ultimately comes of it, I mean,
yeah, I guess it's so they can meet that the princess character, but yeah, it's just like it's something that looks cool, but that's really about where it ends.
and we didn't mention Johann. The production design on Johann is great. He's got like this obnoxious German accent, and he like deflates and reinflates. So again, it's a good character. It's like all the characters are good. The production design is good. There just isn't a whole lot to hang it on to.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that the actual story is pretty generic, and I did not feel any kind of emotional hook to really care about. I mean, it's not like it's a terrible film. It was moderately entertaining, and mainly, for the to marvel at the creativity and the visuals. But other than that, it didn't really hook me much. Do you want to have a complaint session about the changes from the comic books?
I try not to go too much into that because things have to be changed, any kind of adapting process. But romance between Hellboy and Liz Sherman feels weird.
It feels really weird to me, and also I feel like they like the first time you see Liz in this movie, she's literally being like a nagging girlfriend, and then throughout most of the film, she like really doesn't do much. She's just like the girlfriend character, I feel like. And I found that to be really disappointing because Liz is like a really interesting character in her own right. And for whatever reason, they basically like turned her into Hellboy's girlfriend, who her purpose in the story is like to teach him life lessons.
It
And
seems
I,
like it really does a disservice to both characters to sort of simplify them down to a standard, Hollywood movie male female interaction.
right, because he's like the immature hothead, and she's like the nagging girlfriend who has to like teach him what matters in life.
Yeah.
And the hell I should say the characterization of Hellboy feels it feels like pretty close to the comic book, though they definitely lean into like he acts, even though he's like 60 or 70 years old, he acts like a teenager, whereas in the which is not like completely out of character from the comic book, but there's definitely more of like a gravitas to the character in the comics, especially once he becomes more aware of like his horrible destiny. In the comics, all the characters are basically like struggling through catatonic states of depression, and they, for obvious reasons, didn't really go that route in the film.
Yeah, in the movie, I feel like a lot of characters are reduced to sort of standard movie tropes.
Yeah.
You've got
And he,
Hellboy as the cool guy, and then you have his friend who's like a nerd who like knows how to do technology things or knows how to figure stuff out. And then yeah, Johann is the by the book guy who needles them about following regulations. And then as you mentioned, Liz Sherman's kind of the girlfriend character, which does seem like a simplification of all these characters down to a very standard movie convention, like action movie convention role. So I think overall we would say it's kind of a weird adaptation. It's got a lot of good characters. The actors all do a good job with what they're supposed to do. It's got good production design. It has a lot of good technical aspects. Not a lot beating at the heart of it, perhaps.
yeah, it definitely looks great. And beyond that is really, there's not much going on. And as an adaptation, it's, if you care about that as a Hellboy comics fan, as an adaptation, it's pretty wonky.
I would say recommend it if you are into that Del Toro high fantasy,
Yeah,
Pan's Labyrinth kind of thing.
I mean, yeah, Guillermo del Toro has a lot of fans who are like super into his kind of thing. So if you're a Guillermo del Toro fan, you've probably already seen this movie several times. But that's kind of, I feel like, who this is for. So Matt,
Yes, Dustin.
speaking of another timeless comic book character who has been adapted into film several times, how about that Krazy Kat?
So I'd never read Krazy Kat.
We should maybe preface
found-
this by saying that Krazy Kat is a comic strip that ran from 1916 to, I want to say, sometime in the mid 1940s, early 1940s, that ran in both Sundays and dailies. And the first half of its run, it was in black and white. And after that, it was in color. And then we read, and I had read this before, I've read many years of Krazy Kat Sundays, but you had not read this before. And this is a volume that the strip is actually called Krazy Kat, but the collected volume is called Krazy and Ignatz, 1916, 1918. So this is the first like 3 years of Sundays. And Krazy Kat is basically about, it's like a funny animal strip where you have a cat named Krazy, and then there's a mouse named Ignatz, and there's a cop named Officer Pup, and Krazy is in love with Ignatz, and Ignatz does not like Krazy for the most part, and always is trying to torment him. And then Officer Pup is kind of like trying to keep the peace between them. So anyway, Matt, as you were saying about this book.
About Krazy Kat, yeah. So I'd never read this before, and it's interesting. I enjoyed it. It's charming. It's whimsical. The author George Herriman is known for his dialect. So there's like this interesting made up kind of dialect. The whole thing takes place in a quasi fantasy American Southwest looking area, and they have this interesting dialect, and a lot of the characters even have their own dialect, and they're like little slang words.
It takes place in the setting is inspired by Coconino National Forest in Arizona, which I have been to, in which George Herriman apparently had a vacation home.
Is there umbrella trees there in real life?
I don't believe so, but I did not, check everywhere. I did see I think there was like a Krazy Kat named, or like a crazy trailer park there. It was maybe named after the strip. I think that's about all the recognition it got for being the setting, unfortunately. So were you now I'll say that I love Krazy Kat, and I find it to be kind of like endlessly charming. And I have not read like the entire run, but I've read several years of Sundays and several years of dailies. And I was rereading this to talk about this, and I was just so pleasantly charmed by almost like every single strip was delightful to me. I feel like it hits the dynamic of it. It's, you said whimsical, which it definitely is, and there's even though there's like this like violence, because Ignatz always throws bricks at Krazy Kat. That's kind of like his signature thing, and Krazy interprets this as a sign of affection. And so
And never
even
seems to be seriously harmed by it. He's indestructible or something. I
yeah,
guess. I don't know.
it doesn't obey the rules of physical reality with the talking animals that wear clothes.
Yeah.
Does that bother you that Krazy is not immediately killed by getting hit with a brick?
No, so there's a kind of, I felt like digesting this as a modern person. I'm like, there's a violence aspect, and Krazy is in love with Ignatz, and Ignatz keeps hitting him with bricks in the head. And I'm like,
Right.
am I supposed to feel bad for Krazy? Because I do feel bad for him. But on the other hand, why is he still in love with Ignatz, his little darlink, little darlink,
Yeah,
little angel?
but Krazy enjoys getting hit in the head with bricks,
Right. He considers it a sign of affection, and it makes him happy.
and it doesn't seem to hurt. So yeah, overall, like the strips will will often end on a happy note as Krazy gets pelted in the head with something. It's also interesting because as you read, Krazy, the character of Krazy, changes gender frequently. Like sometimes Krazy will be a he, and sometimes Krazy will be a she, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, there's a strip where there's a beauty parlor, and it specifically talks about how all women like to go to beauty parlors, right? And then Krazy goes by, and Krazy goes into the beauty parlor. In that exact strip, Ignatz refers to Krazy as a he, using a masculine pronoun. But then Krazy goes into the beauty parlor, and no one remarks that it's unusual that a man is going into the beauty parlor. And then Krazy comes out. The text says that Krazy is now blonde, although the art just makes him look like he's been bleached white. And then Ignatz all of a sudden is attracted to him, not realizing that it's Krazy.
Yeah, and a lot of people have written about those kind of strips because George Herriman was a black man who like basically passed as white for during his life, and so people have kind of written about those kind of like color changes as maybe some kind of like subtext on race, being that like Krazy, to him becomes more attractive or maybe more pleasing to the public eye when he's like white instead of black. So, there is, even though it is like a funny animal strip, and I guess a person could be accused of reading too much into it, but there does seem to be some kind of subtle play that you find in regards to like racial and like gender issues, which I enjoy. So I guess I'm trying to, because I said I love Krazy Kat, I find both the art and the writing to be pretty wonderful. Did you have trouble getting through this book, or like what was your? You sound like you were kind of mixed on this strip.
I wouldn't say I was mixed. So the art, if you want to talk about the art is tremendous. He does a lot of amazing technical things. So there's strips that are whole slanted sideways, like rolling down a hill, and the panel is literally like a slant going down a hill. And he does jokes with like the horizon line, like whether it's a line or not, and there's things with like perspective, and passage of time. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening in the art. The whole background is like this fantasy desert landscape with the literal umbrella trees. And he has like the shooting stars come down, and then they pick them up and they're babies, and the stork delivers them, and there's like the enchanted mesa. So there's a lot of really amazing things happening in the art. I don't think anyone would disagree with me there. Krazy has a fairly large following. Yeah, so the art is great. He does a lot of interesting things with just the structure of a strip, like the idea that you have this one page to tell a complete story, beginning, middle, and end. And he shows you a lot of different environments. There's a lot of funny little jokes because like Krazy goes into the water and there's Krazy Catfish, is his
Yeah,
cousin who is a fish who looks just like him except in a fish form. And then he goes into the air and there's like Krazy Catbird, who is
yeah,
a bird who's also a cat that can fly. Ignatz Mouse has like a little gang of mice thieves.
yeah. Ignatz Mouse has a wife and like 9 kids or something, which he'll occasionally recruit in his mischievous schemes.
So no, I like Krazy Kat. I don't know if I quite blown away, maybe not by the early ones as you are, but I do like it. I think it's fun. Um, it leaves you with a lot of little interesting thoughts. Yeah, because of the whole relation between the characters is so interesting. It's, you read it and you're not I feel like you're not always sure what exactly to take from it. So it kind of makes you think a little bit. At least that's how
Yeah,
I felt.
yeah, I think subtextually there is maybe a little more going on than you would perhaps expect with just like a funny animal joke strip. I was gonna say also, I feel like a lot of cartoonists will sometimes get short shrift in conversations about writing and about comics writers because, in mainstream American comics, there's often this really stark division of labor where there are like comics writers and then there are comics artists. And of course, back in the day with strips, a lot of them were, doing both. And obviously, you have like people today, of course, who do both a lot as well. But for some reason, the conversation about this kind of thing usually seems to devolve into separate categories of people. But anyway, I feel like George Herriman is maybe underrated as a writer because I find the wordplay at hand to often be really clever and really enjoyable. Like you said, he writes in this like weird kind of like, well, I don't know if it's weird. I think it's inspired by something specifically, maybe like a New Orleans kind of slang, because I think that's where he's from, as I recall. But he writes in this sort of really specific like dialect, and there's often a lot of like wordplay and like odd like jokes and stuff that I think is actually like really clever and like really well done. And for whatever reason, I mean, I know the reason is, but I just think that he perhaps doesn't get his due just as like a pure writer of comics, as like a wordsmith.
Yeah, because we talked about, well, we talked a little bit. We looked at The Spirit, which was also a strip. And, Krazy Kat and Spirit, although the Krazy predates Eisner by a number of years. But if you look at other like comic strips from this time period, I know I've read some of like the old Superman strips, and the technical level is much lower than what you're seeing with Krazy Kat. And George Herriman, I mean, yeah, this starts in the year 1916.
Yeah,
That's kind of insane.
There's a joke in this book about the Kaiser, like as it overlaps with
Yeah, because they
World
make
War
references to World War One because you're supposed to have a hog, a personal hog, and Ignatz is sad because he doesn't have a pig. And they also talk about collecting potatoes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it really does seem like George Herriman should have a higher name recognition because I guess I haven't really seen him mentioned in a lot of things.
I mean, he was.
Krazy Kat doesn't have a lot of recognition. I know he was well regarded, in his lifetime because it mentioned that E.E. Cummings, I think, wrote a foreword to a very early Krazy collection.
Yeah, and the strip was apparently not popular, but was kept alive just because I think it was William Randolph Hearst was a big fan, so he kept it alive, even though a lot of newspapers wanted to cancel it because they like didn't get it and thought it was too weird. And also, it should be. I feel like I should mention that the Comics Journal listed when they did a list of like the 100 greatest works of comics in history, they put Krazy Kat at number one.
Number one, ahead of everything.
Yeah, they put it as like the greatest work of comics in history, so it has got like, some recognition in specific circles, but in terms of like mainstream comics fans, strips in general are not really that talked about, and unless it's like Calvin and Hobbes, like everyone loves Calvin and Hobbes, but beyond that, strips don't get talked about, and that's, I guess, part of the reason why George Herriman does not get his due, both as like an artist, as a penciler, and as a writer, and as an overall cartoonist. I feel like I think when it comes to people who are really good at writing comics, everyone will go to like, oh, Alan Moore or whatever, which, not that Alan Moore doesn't deserve it, but I feel like someone like George Herriman also deserves to be in that conversation, even though obviously his stuff is very different, but just in terms of like pure, crafting words together.
Right, because he has the entire dialect that the characters speak in, and you're talking about creating this whole little world and then telling entire stories in one page.
Yeah, and like the daily strips, you mentioned the creativity in the panel design, which I think is one of the standouts of why the Sundays are so popular, because he was also doing this as a daily strip, and the daily strips have been much more sporadically collected. whereas the Sundays are all available in collected volumes. And I think the Sundays are generally considered to be, where he would let the creativity run rampant, and that's where you get these like wild page designs. But the daily strips are also fun too, though they're much more, conventional.
Yeah, so I enjoyed reading Krazy. I think it's fun. There's a lot of little, like you said, there's a lot of little jokes and things going on. There is some subtext there, and I'm not sure how much we want to read into the subtext, especially considering the time it was written. I mean, if this came out now, we would probably try and figure out whether Krazy was like a non-binary person, and
Well, I know
the relation of heteronormativity to Ignatz being attracted to him/her when Krazy is like blonde as opposed to black-haired.
Yeah, and I know George Herriman had said that Krazy was meant to be some kind of like gender fluid forest sprite, sort of like, angelic fairy sort of character. Let me ask you this. Are you interested enough to read more Krazy Kat strips, or do you have any final thoughts on this book?
Yeah, no, I would want to read more of it. I think anyone that's interested in comics as an art form or the history of comics should definitely read it, because I feel like it does deserve a spot in there. You mentioned Comics Journal, put it as their number one. I am not Comics Journal, nor am I qualified or feel qualified to say something is the best that there ever was, but it's definitely worth reading. I think there's a lot going on there, both on a technical art level and in the dialect, in the storylines, in the little jokes and everything.
Yeah, and I should say too, just that when you read it, it's since each page is like a strip, it's easy. You can just like read a couple at a time. I don't know how well it works to like try to plow through it in one sitting, but I find it really charming to just plop down and read a half dozen and just be charmed like that. Or because obviously when they came out, they were meant to be read like once a week. So. But yeah,
how fun would that be to live in a world where you get your newspaper and you have just like Krazy Kat every week?
That would be you mean you don't like getting your newspaper and reading Dilbert?
I did used to get a newspaper, and I did read through the comics. I don't remember there being any standouts. I don't even get a newspaper now.
I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on comic strips. I've read some old comic strips, but not as many as I should. And this might just be like a bias, but I do feel like that comic strips now are generally not very good. But that's a conversation for another time. I think overall, Krazy Kat, it is superb.
Superb, tremendous, charming, whimsical.
All of this and more.
Krazy just can't catch a break.
No, but he's delighted by the small things in life, which seems to keep him on a pretty even keel.
Right.
So we'll leave it there with that was Krazy and Ignatz, 1918, a book that collected the first 3 years of the Sundays of that strip. So, Matt, do you have a recommendation to go with our conversation from this week?
For my recommendation this episode, I'm going to put forward a Hellboy story called Hellboy the Crooked Man, which was a 3-issue miniseries featuring some absolutely stellar and tremendous art by Richard Corbin and written by Hellboy creator Mike Mignola. The story sort of delves into the folklore and horror stories of Appalachia, or the eastern seaboard of the United States area, and is kind of based on the John the Balladeer pulp stories written by Manly Wade Wellman. It comes in a collection called Hellboy the Crooked Man and Other Stories. So that would be my Hellboy-themed recommendation for this episode.
For my recommendation, I'm going to go with another comic strip. And Matt, you said that some of the comic strips and some of the comics work that were contemporaneous to Krazy Kat were maybe not all that stellar from a technical standpoint and from an art standpoint. And I think that's maybe not all that true when it comes to comic strips. It might be true for something like Superman, and I think it definitely was true for a lot of like mainstream superhero style comic books, which often looked really crude. But one thing that it was definitely not true for was a comic strip by the title of Flash Gordon by Alex Raymond. And this is obviously a very famous comic strip and went on to become a very famous character. But if you go back to the comic strip, it is a really fun read and it's just beautiful to behold. It's a really influential and really fun and just a completely gorgeous comic strip. So that's Flash Gordon, Alex Raymond.
As always, you can find us on the web at armyofcrime.com. I am on Twitter at armyofcrime. Dustin is on Twitter at Dustin44444. Check out the website. If you want to look at any of the things we recommended, we try and post links so you can find all of the stuff. As always, if you want to leave us a review, we would definitely appreciate that. I see we have a couple listeners from international areas. I saw a download in Germany, a couple downloads in Nepal. If you're one of those people, feel free to leave a review in whatever app that you use. As always, keep those bricks flying, everyone. See you next time. Is that your segue into our episode?